politically sensitive disputes, whether in the Balkans in the 1990s or here.
Washington Journal airs live every morning at 7 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN. We're going live now to the U.S. House for votes on measures debated earlier.
Resolution providing for consideration of the bill, H.R. 761, to require the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture to more efficiently develop domestic sources of the minerals and mineral materials of strategic and critical importance to United States economic and national security and manufacturing competitiveness.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed. Thank you. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, proceedings will resume on the motions to suspend the rules previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order: H.R. 3092 by the yeas and nays, H.R. 2449 by the yeas and nays, S. 793 by the yeas and nays. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion from the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3092 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3092, a bill to amend the Missing Children's Assistance Act and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
3 votes in this series. This one makes a number of changes to the Missing Children's Assistance Act, including authorizing the appropriation of $40 million a year through fiscal 2018, most of which would be used for annual grants. During these votes, members plan a moment of silence for the 12 victims killed in yesterday's Washington Navy Yard shooting. Today, one day after the shooting, a draft of a Pentagon Inspector General report found 52 convicted felons received routine, unauthorized access to military facilities. The Hill writes that House Armed Services Committee Chairman Buck McKeon said the report found the Navy had critical flaws in controlling access to military installations for non-governmental personnel, including contractors. The full report is expected to be released next month. And in the aftermath of the Navy Yard shooting, the National Journal writes that Senator Dianne Feinstein, one of the Senate's leading voices on gun control, called again for stricter gun laws. And Politico writes that while House Minority Whip Steny Hoyer says that he expects the shooting at the Navy Yard to renew the discussion on gun control, he expressed skepticism that legislative action will be taken. Congressman Hoyer spoke at a Politico breakfast this morning, which we covered and will have for you after the House goes out tonight, here on C-SPAN and anytime at cspan.org. Again, the House will hold a moment of silence for the victims of the Navy Yard shooting during these votes. Later this week in the House, we expect a debate on the nutrition bill that the Congressional Budget Office estimates will remove some 3.8 million people from the food stamp program and other nutrition programs. Here's more about the bill.
Republicans are planning on taking up a revised nutrition assistance bill later this week. We're joined by Derek Wallbank, Congress reporter for Bloomberg News. What's going to be in this bill?
Well, it's going to be most of what was in the nutrition title from the last time that Republicans brought up a combined food and farm bill. That is to say, they went last time with $20.5 billion in cuts to nutrition spending, but this time it's about double that. The Congressional Budget Office says that we're in store for about $39 billion in cuts over compared to CBO's 10-year baseline. What that means that state work requirements that can be waived can't be waived as much. It means that we're looking at some restrictions on eligibility programs, because it's not like with this bill you just say, I want to cut this amount of money. What it is instead is you say, well, we want to change these eligibility requirements, and that leads to a certain amount of cuts. This is a contrast. This is about almost 10 times as much of a cut as the Senate has in their nutrition portion of their farm bill. So this is quite a gulf with what we've seen come earlier.
Well, you mentioned this time versus last time. Take us back. Why was this nutrition part of it, which used to be called the food stamp portion, why was this separated out from the Farm Bill?
Well, let's go really, really far back. This originally came up in sort of the 60s, 70s, and a little bit before as a coalition deal to get farm spending through. You'd have urban votes for farm policy. You'd have food vote. You'd have rural votes for food stamp programs. And in 1973, you get a nutrition title added to the Farm Bill. 1977, you're seeing food stamps more in their current form as kind of more of a welfare style policy, free aid rather than increasing purchasing power. So really, this is an alliance that has passed farm policy for quite a long time. Fast forward to this summer, and you had a bill come up with $20.5 billion over 10 years in food stamp cuts that fell on the House floor. It was a stunning rejection. Democrats who thought that it cut way too much, thought that Republican amendments at the last second were too much. They didn't want to go for them. They cleaved off en masse, and there wasn't sufficient Republican support, including from some people who said, look, this doesn't cut enough. So House Republican leaders went back to the drawing board. They looked through August and they said, look, here's the deal. We're going to try and pass something with Republican-only support. And the Republican-only support means that we're going to have to cut more than we were doing before. Now, there's a Republican argument that says, look, there's a lot of waste in the system. There are people who are getting these benefits that don't need them. The example you're going to hear a lot in this debate is of somebody in California. A surfer in California was in a memo that I saw that's being passed around who's using food stamps for a lobster. You're going to see talks about lottery winners. That was included in the previous version. That's back again. Banning lottery winners like one in Michigan from having food stamps. You're going to see a lot of those sorts of concerns battling up again against Democrats who say, look, you're going to kick people off of food stamps who need it. They're going to say that the rise in food stamp spending is due to the recession. That, of course, there are more people on food stamps now than there were in 2008, they say, because the economy's worse. And it's a simple one-to-one. Congressional Budget Office forecasts a decline in food stamps, in food stamp recipients, regardless of what happens. The question here is, should we stay at that level, or should we go much, much more?
And looking ahead to the Senate, will the Senate take up this bill if it passes the House?
I talked to Debbie Stabenow today about that. I asked her point blank, would you take this if it were in conference? She said absolutely not. The Senate does not want to see this. Senate Democrats do not want to see this. They didn't like decoupling food stamps from the Farm Bill in the first place. They don't like that this is a 3-year authorization. This is written as a 3-year authorization. Farm Bill is written as 5. If that goes forward, that could lead to a permanent divorce of food stamps from the Farm Bill. That's a policy they do not want to see. And so there are many things in here that Senate Democrats find objectionable, and you will hear House Democrats advancing their arguments on the floor this week.
Congress reporter for Bloomberg News, Derek Wallbank, thanks for the update.
Thank you so much for having me.
That nutrition assistance bill that we just heard about is expected to come up in the House on Thursday. Right now, Senator John McCain is speaking about Syria live on C-SPAN 3. The conversation is being held at the Council on Foreign Relations. Again, that's live right now on C-SPAN 3. Syria was also a topic at the White House briefing today, along with efforts to tie the debt ceiling and budget negotiations to defunding the health care law. We'll watch part of the briefing during this vote.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Before I take your questions, I had a couple of things to mention at the top. First, the President will welcome Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House on Monday, September 30th. The President looks forward to discussing with Prime Minister Netanyahu the progress on final status negotiations with the Palestinians, as well as developments in Iran, Syria, and elsewhere in the region. Secondly, I have some good news on health care today. About which I have a visual aid. Today, the Department of Health and Human Services has released a new report showing that nearly 6 out of 10 Americans who currently do not have insurance could get coverage for less than $100 a month per person under the health care law when the health insurance marketplace is open for business, with the help of tax credits and Medicaid. Overall, that's 23.2 million people, or 56% of the uninsured. And if all 50 states expand Medicaid, as called for under the Affordable Care Act, the number of Americans who could get health insurance for less than $100 per month would rise to nearly 8 out of every 10 Americans, or 78% of the uninsured. Now that's 32.1 million Americans who could get health insurance for under $100 per month if all governors followed the lead of the Republican governors in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, and North Dakota. This news also shows that forcing insurers to compete for your business, holding insurance companies accountable for the way they treat customers, and offering tax credits to make health care even more affordable have great potential to deliver affordable health care. And for the people who already have insurance, this means no longer having to worry about being denied coverage for a pre-existing condition, or losing health coverage when switching jobs, or having the unpaid bills of the uninsured significantly drive up health insurance for everyone else. This news comes after the Census Bureau reported that the percent of uninsured Americans fell in 2012, in part thanks to gains in coverage of young adults on their parents' policies, thanks again to the Affordable Care Act. Now this is good news for uninsured Americans and their families who finally will have a simple way to get quality, affordable health care when the marketplace is open on October 1st. With that, I will take your questions.
A couple of questions on the Navy Yard shooting. Does the President have any plans to meet with first responders, victims' families, considering that this shooting happened so close to the White House?
Well, I have no meetings of that nature to announce today. What I can tell you is that later this afternoon, the President will receive a briefing from Attorney General Eric Holder, FBI Director James Comey, and members of his national security team on yesterday's horrific shooting at the Washington Navy Yard. The President has obviously been updated regularly, including this morning at his PDB, on developments in that matter, but he will get a specific briefing from the Attorney General and the FBI Director this afternoon.
What time?
I don't have the time for that. Later this afternoon, Mark.
Did any of the updates you received this morning or last night focus on what the motivation of the shooter may have been? There's also been some reports about the shooter's mental health condition.
Matters regarding the investigation itself, I have to refer to the FBI, which has the lead. And this is obviously something that's still under investigation, having just happened yesterday. The President, as he said yesterday, wants to express his condolences and to send his thoughts and prayers to the victims and their families. He wants to commend the first responders who did a remarkable job and responded quite quickly, saving lives and putting their own lives at risk as they did so. But in terms of the investigation itself, motivation and other issues that will be decided by that investigation, we have to wait and see what the investigators provide.
The President spoke quite emotionally after the Newtown shooting. He has made visits after other shootings to cities, towns that have been affected by gun violence. Does he feel in any way, I don't know if he can kind of tell from his perch here, but does he feel in any way like the reaction to this shooting may not have been quite as intense as it has after other incidents, that maybe there's some sort of numbness among the public because these shootings have happened so frequently?
I know that he was horrified by this news, and while it is a sad truth that we in America seem to experience these mass shootings with all too much frequency, they are always horrifying, and the senseless violence and the senseless loss of life is a source of great pain for those who experience it in those communities, and for everyone here in America, I think, who watches the images and can imagine the fear associated with an event like that. So I certainly don't have an observation from the President along those lines to make. When it comes to Newtown, I think it goes without saying that there's a particular horror when the victims are so young.
And just one quick one on Brazil. We obviously got a statement right before we came out here. Does the White House see this decision by Dilma Rousseff to cancel this state dinner as a setback for this relationship, which the U.S. has really tried to cultivate and grow for the past few years?
I think it's because the relationship is so important and because it has so many facets that the President agrees with this decision that they made together to postpone the visit. And they both look forward to that visit, which will celebrate our broad relationship. And the President believes, and President Rousseff believes, as I understand it, should not be overshadowed by any single bilateral issue, no matter how important or challenging the issue may be. And we're certainly acknowledging that the concerns that these disclosures have generated in Brazil and other countries. Was this decision made in their phone call last night? It was discussed in their phone call last night and finalized, yes. Yes.
Jay, on the Navy Yard, the suspect apparently had a clearance to access that facility despite a history of mental problems. Does the President have any concerns about the clearance process and who's allowed to have access to facilities like that merits review?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. There's obviously been a variety of reports, and all of these matters are under investigation. And as we've seen in this incident, as we do so often, some reports may or may not be true, and so I'm certainly not going to comment on an unfolding story, especially one that's under investigation by the FBI. On the broader issue of clearances, as you know, DNI is currently undertaking a review of security clearance policy for certain contractors. And I can tell you that at the President's direction, OMB is examining standards for contractors and employees across federal agencies. So this is obviously a matter that the President believes and has believed merits review.
Is DNI thinking in the wake of this?
The DNI, well, no, that was announced previously. The OMB action is something that is getting underway.
On the budget, quickly, a number of Democrats are now endorsing the idea of so-called clean CR, even though there are concerns about enshrining the post-sequester levels of funding. You had said the other day that the President would be supportive of that as long as the clean bill. Is that still his position?
Well, a short-term clean CR that would allow Congress the time to reach a broader agreement is something that we could accept. Well, unfortunately, what we've seen from some Republicans is a desire to refight and relitigate old battles and to be willing to shut down the government, doing harm to the middle class, and to be willing even to allow the United States to default, something we've never done in our history, if they don't get what they want, which is to achieve through this kind of procedure what they could not achieve when it was passed by the House. This is Obamacare, passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed into law by the President, upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, and a law that we are going about the business of implementing, and a law that has already produced tangible benefits to millions of Americans. Tangible in many ways, including in financial ways that we've elaborated on in recent days. So, that is an obstacle that we currently face, and which, as the President mentioned yesterday, needs to be addressed, because it is simply unacceptable at a time 5 years after the financial collapse, 5 years after this country stared into the economic abyss, 5 years of slow, steady recovery later, that we cannot allow Washington to reverse that progress and to do it for the ideological agenda of a faction of the Republican Party.
What would the President hope to accomplish in that period of the short-term CR, the broader issues, and Does he intend to remain passive in this process with so little time left?
The idea that he's passive is, of course, disproven by the facts, but the President has put forward a compromise budget proposal that anybody who looks at will say, if he or she is serious, represents hard choices by a Democratic president when it comes to entitlement savings, and asks for, in return, hard choices by Republicans when it comes to a balanced approach to reducing our deficit. That's the way that we should go about the business of continuing to deal with our deficit. But Republicans aren't even talking about that anymore. It's hard to when the deficit has come down by half since the President took office. Instead, they're talking about basically hitching the fate of the economy, the American economy and the global economy, to their ideological agenda, which is to continue to fight the battle over the Affordable Care Act, a law that, as I said today, is producing enormous benefits for the American people and will produce even more for millions and millions of uninsured Americans who, until this law passed and until this law gets implemented, have not had access to affordable care but will because of this. They want to overturn that, and they have no alternative. Their answer to those millions of Americans is tough luck. Tough luck. And by the way, if I don't get what I want, they say we're going to, set all that progress aside and reverse course. That's a terrible approach. Jim.
Jay, I know Ed asked this yesterday, but you've had a day to reflect. Still a good idea for the President to give what was a very partisan speech yesterday, even after what happened over at the Navy Yard?
Look, I understand some Republicans are trying to make something of this. The President spoke about the Navy Yard at the very top of his briefing. He talked about the cowardly act that had taken place, the tragedy that was unfolding and the loss of life. And he called for and demanded a seamless investigation with federal and local law enforcement officials, and that is what we're seeing now. It is a fact that we have very little time for Congress to act, and the consequences for the American economy of Congress failing to act would be significant. And it is absolutely important, part of his job, to talk about that to the American people. And far from being a partisan speech, the President made clear in his speech that many Republicans on Capitol Hill agree with him that we should not go down the road of threatening to shut down the government or defaulting on our obligations in the name of some partisan agenda item or partisan pursuit. But unfortunately, there is a faction that many, including in some op-ed pages, have noted, conservative op-ed pages have noted, are not doing a great service to their own party, let alone to the country or the middle class, by pursuing this agenda. So, these deadlines are upon us, and Congress needs to act. Congress needs to fulfill its basic responsibility, which is to ensure that government functions are funded. Congress needs to fulfill its other basic responsibility, which is to ensure that it pays the bills that Congress racked up. That's what the debt ceiling is all about, and it's hard to break through because it's a phrase that just reeks of sort of Washington arcane discussions, debt ceilings, raising the debt limit, that kind of thing. But what it is basically allowing Congress to pay the bills that Congress already racked up. Full stop. Has nothing to do with future spending. It has to do with the United States of America being true to its obligations.
And Jay, Navy Yard, Newtown, Tucson, Aurora, Fort Hood, is the President concerned that his presidency will be marked by an inability to resolve this issue of mass shootings?
The President believes, and I think has shown, that we ought to do everything we can to implement common sense measures to reduce gun violence in America. He came out with a comprehensive plan to do that included calls for legislative action in Congress, as well as numerous executive actions that his administration could take without Congress. The President has, and his team have acted on all of those administrative actions and have added to those administrative actions. As recently as a couple of weeks ago, we had an announcement about 2 more executive actions that the administration is moving on. And he has not in the least hidden his displeasure and disappointment in Congress for its failure to pass legislation that's supported by 80 to 90% of the American people, by majorities of the American people in virtually every state in the country. I mean, you could not define a case of Congress or a minority in Congress, a minority in the Senate, taking its cues from a narrow special interest better than this, right? When you vote against 80 or 90% of the American people, when you vote against a majority of your constituents in answer to or at the behest of a special interest, you are serving that narrow special interest. You're not serving your constituents. And the President believes we are continuing to push the cause of common sense. Again, I can recite to you, as recently as 2 weeks ago, I'm sure CNN covered it in detail all day long, the executive actions that this administration took to further reduce gun violence in America. And we continue to hope and we continue to press that Congress will take action. But I think your question should be addressed to those senators who chose to ignore the will of their constituents and ignore the will of the American people. I believe that 85% of Democrats or more voted for, right? Am I right? 85%, maybe 90% of Senate Democrats voted for it. And what percentage of Republicans voted for it? So the problem here is not Democrats. The problem here is senators, overwhelmingly from one party, who refuse to do something very simple, which is expand a background check system that everyone believes functions well but needs to function better. And you know, it's their choice. Those questions should be addressed to those senators.
And very quickly on Syria, the Russians responded to the UN report by saying, well, it's still possible that the rebels might have done this on August 21st. That doesn't bode well, does it, for this process that's underway?
Well, they can believe what they want or say what they want. The facts prove otherwise. They're overwhelming. The facts that we presented, the facts that the inspection team presented. What matters when it comes to the process going forward is not statements like that. What matters is what the Russians do to ensure that Syria upholds its commitments, and that Russia upholds its commitment to see this agreement through, which calls for an aggressive timetable in accounting for and securing Assad's chemical weapons inventory.
Jay, just a follow-up on yesterday.
Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion from the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2449, on which of the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 153, H.R. 2449, a bill to authorize the President to extend the term of the Agreement for Cooperation between the Government of the United States of America and the Government of the Republic of Korea concerning civil uses of nuclear energy for a period not to exceed March 19, 2016.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
This vote on a bill that would authorize the President to extend for up to 2 years the existing civil nuclear energy agreement between the U.S. and Korea. A summary in Congressional Quarterly says it's to provide additional time to negotiate a new agreement. In addition to the House and Senate, we'll also have live coverage tomorrow of the House Armed Services Committee hearing on the 2014 military budget and also sequestration budget cuts. That's at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3. And in the afternoon, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke will hold his quarterly news conference. That'll be live at 2:30 Eastern, also on C-SPAN 3. And wanted to mention that the conversation with Senator John McCain on Syria is still going on live on C-SPAN 3 right now. It's hosted by the Council on Foreign Relations. Again, that's live right now on C-SPAN 3.
The yeas are 407, the nays 0. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to consider is laid on the table. The House will be in order. Members will please take their seats. Members will please take a seat. For what purpose does General Lady from the District of Columbia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank 4 former officers of the United States Navy, Representatives Murphy, Braun, Bridenstine, and DeSantis, for joining me as I rise in tribute to 12 Americans, almost all federal employees, who lost their lives in the service of the United States yesterday in a mass shooting at the Navy Yard. They were civilian employees doing work for the Naval Sea Systems Command. Unlike the blue-collar workers of the old Navy Yard, Naval Sea Systems Command employees are skilled white-collar workers, highly trained to offer technical support for building, buying, and manufacturing the Navy's ships and combat systems. The Navy Yard was renovated with historic deference to the old manufacturing workplace, and the Naval Sea Systems Command jump-started the development of the neighborhood that received them. The Naval Sea Systems Command became a good neighbor, though we knew little of the work done in that secure facility. We did know this: these federal employees deserved our respect and our admiration because they and their work were vital to our nation. We ask the House to join us for a moment of silence for these 12 who gave all they had for their country. Michael Arnold, Martin Bodrog, Arthur Daniels, Sylvia Frazier, Kathleen Godd, John Roger Johnson, Mary Frances Knight, Frank Kohler, Vishu Bandit, Kenneth Bernard Proctor, Gerald L. Reed, and Richard Michael Rigel.
The House will observe a moment of silence.
Thank you.
Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, to suspend the rules and pass S. 793 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 793, an act to support revitalization and reform of the Organization of American States and for other purposes.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. There's a 5-minute vote.
We just saw the House observe a moment of silence for those who died at the Washington Navy Yard yesterday. Senate leaders Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell spoke about the shooting during their opening remarks on the Senate floor this morning.
Mr. President, there are no words that can possibly ease the pain of the rampage and certainly the deaths involving a dozen human beings who were killed yesterday at the Naval Yard. I hope it's some small comfort that this city, this institution, the United States Senate, and a whole nation mourn alongside them. To my knowledge, there's no explanation for the violence that occurred yesterday. My thoughts are with those who are suffering as a result of the loss of their loved ones, and also those people who are recovering from the wounds, and some of them were very serious. I wish them a speedy recovery. Mr. President, we have about 16,000 military and civilian employees who work in the Naval Yard complex, as well as their friends, family members who were affected by this tragedy. It was only a few days ago, and the officer presiding was here at on that occasion also, when we as members of Congress marked the anniversary of September 11th, 2001, during a ceremony on the steps of the Capitol, but we had a moment of silence here in the Senate. Yesterday's shootings are the worst loss of life in the Capital region since those September 11th attacks. It centered on the Pentagon as far as in this area. Last week's significant anniversary and yesterday's terrible violence are a reminder that life is fragile and precious. They're a reminder of the debt we owe to those who protect our freedom and our safety, whether they serve in the military or as first responders. The Sergeant at Arms, who was responsible for our safety, was certainly on the job yesterday. He is a dedicated police officer. That's his goal. I still refer to him as Chief Gaynor. He's been Chief of Police of the Capitol Police Force before he took responsibility as Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. He's been a street officer a long time. He could have done other things. He has a law degree. He's a well-educated man. But his responsibility is to take care of the Senate, and he does that very well. I appreciate very, very much, I speak for the entire Senate, of those dedicated police, fire, rescue, who put their lives on the line to prevent a lot more loss of life on Monday. In particular, Mr. President, the city owes a debt of gratitude to a K-9 officer, a 24-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Force, a man by the name of Scott Williams, who was hurt very, very badly in the shootings. I wish him a full recovery and thank him for his selflessness.
This morning, all of us are thinking about yesterday's tragic events at the Navy Yard. And we're also thinking in particular of the brave men and women of our military and the sacrifices they make day in and day out on our behalf. Once again, I'd like to extend condolences to the families and friends of those who lost their lives or were injured in this terrible, terrible shooting. Know that your country is with you in these most difficult moments. And also like, again, to express sincere gratitude to all the first responders and medical personnel and law enforcement officers from so many different agencies who work together to keep all of us informed and, most of all, safe throughout the day.
You can see more of what members of the House and Senate have said about what happened yesterday at the Washington Navy Yard at cspan.org. This is the last vote of the day on a bill that deals with developing a strategy to reinforce the core competencies of the Organization of American States. If this passes, the measure would return to the Senate.
On this vote, the yeas are 383, the nays are 24, 0 recorded as present. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Okay. The House will be in order. The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute. The House will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Give it a minute. Again, please take your conversations off the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to thank the many first responders, National Guard, volunteers, and local leaders who have worked tirelessly beginning middle of last week to respond to the floods in Colorado. An area the size of Connecticut has been impacted by over 20 inches of rain in certain areas of the state. 19,000 homes have been damaged or destroyed. Countless people have had their lives changed forever. But as is the case with all tragedies in Colorado and across this great country, we come together as a community, as neighbors, to help one another in times such as these. And we know in the months and years to come, there will be great challenges. There will be trying times as we try to find answers to those families who lost so much. And so, Mr. Speaker, the House, as we recognize those efforts such as HelpColoradoNow.org that are doing so much to do so much good for the people there. This has happened before, great tragedy when we've come together, but we will rise up, we will be stronger, because we are Colorado. I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for one minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, several weeks ago we had a deeply partisan debate about cuts to SNAP. The proposed cuts by the majority were then $20 billion, a number that many of my colleagues and I found unacceptable and rejected. The majority has now doubled these cuts to $40 billion a year, 9 times the amount passed in a bipartisan vote in the Senate. They have abandoned all attempts at bipartisanship and compromise to satisfy the unreasonable demands of the far right. Mr. Speaker, we should not be playing politics with a program that means so much to American families. The $40 billion in cuts will slash benefits to as many as 6 million Americans, including 170,000 veterans. The average benefit for SNAP is only $4.50 a day, just $1.50 a meal. As someone who benefited from food stamps when I was a teenager, I know what this safety net means. This benefit is the difference between a child going to bed hungry or having the energy to focus on school. It is a safety net that allows low-income seniors to be able to both eat and afford medication. In my district, the poverty rate rose from 5.3% in 2000 to 9.2% in 2011. We need to be finding ways to reduce poverty in our communities, not cutting programs like SNAP that work. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it seems the administration has finally made up its mind and will arm the Syrian rebels. Never mind, Syria is in a messy midst of a civil war. That involvement is not in the national security interest of the United States. The other rebel groups include foreign mercenaries, criminals, and in my opinion, half are al-Qaeda operatives. That includes al-Qaeda from the state of Iraq and al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda terrorist group. Last I heard, Mr. Speaker, the United States is at war with al-Qaeda. There is no way our government can prevent the guns sent to Syria from getting into the hands of al-Qaeda rebels. The administration constantly and conveniently goes out of its way to keep Americans from possessing firearms, but it seems to be enthusiastically delighting in running guns to other countries, to groups like drug cartels in Mexico, rebel groups in Libya, and al-Qaeda in Syria. Odd gun policy, don't you think, Mr. Speaker? And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today the Safe Climate Caucus held a remarkable forum. It was the first time in Congress that individuals were invited to talk about the personal hardships they have experienced as a result of climate change. We heard from witnesses from around the country. Matt Russell, an Iowa farmer, told us how his crops had been flooded by record rains. Hugh Fitzsimmons, a Texas rancher, described how his herd was decimated by a record drought. And Emily Dondero from Sonora, California, explained how the massive California rim fire is devastating her community. Stephanie Kravitz, a New York homeowner, talked about the devastation she suffered when Superstorm Sandy struck Long Island, New York, and Reverend Tyrone Edwards from Louisiana spoke movingly of the damage inflicted on his community by enormous hurricanes. For these Americans, climate change is already painfully real. They told us climate change is not a distant threat. As scientist Noah Diffenbach explained, it's already affecting families across the country. The witnesses asked that Congress stop denying the science. They want action, and I think it's about time we start to listen.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, when unlicensed and unaccredited providers are allowed to deliver prosthetic and orthotic services through Medicare, both Medicare beneficiaries and American taxpayers are shortchanged. Unfortunately, the orthotics and prosthetics market currently is prone to fraud and abuse, where substandard products and services are being furnished to Medicare beneficiaries and other patients. Despite congressional mandates, not enough has been done to ensure that legitimate practitioners are providing these items and services. Moments ago, I introduced the Medicare Orthotics and Prosthetics Improvement Act of 2013, along with my colleague, Mike Thompson of California. This common-sense piece of legislation will protect Medicare beneficiaries by identifying and addressing fraudulent payments and hold government accountable by reducing fraud and abuse within Medicare. Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join us in this bipartisan effort by co-sponsoring H.R. 3112. The Medicare Orthotics and Prosthetics Improvement Act of 2013. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back to balance my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I heard pow, pow, pow. Then for a few seconds it stopped. And then pow, pow, pow. I just started running. The sentiments of this newspaper fell upon me and many other Americans. The word again. Another mass shooting in the United States of America. Now at the Naval Sea Systems Command, at the Naval Command here in Washington, D.C. Coming from Texas reminded me of the horrific tragedy and terrorist act of Fort Hood. If you could not call this terrorism, you could call it a domestic rampage. But what you could call it is a failing for what we in the United States Congress have not done, and that is to pass universal background checks and to focus on the mental health needs of those who are disturbed and might cause the havoc and the loss of life for so many that families today mourn. The question becomes, as we stand here today, how much longer will it take us to pass sensible gun legislation to stop this violence? I pray for those who've lost their life, Mr. Speaker, and I ask this Congress to act and pass universal background checks and the stopping of these ridiculous top secret clearance by outsourcing. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this is National Child Cancer Awareness Month. Childhood cancers are the leading cause of death by disease amongst children in our country, and each year nearly 13,400 children are diagnosed with cancer. I've been privileged to have met many doctors and researchers who spend every day searching for answers in Minnesota's award-winning institutions like the Mayo Clinic, the Children's Hospital of Minnesota, Gillette's Children's Hospital, and the University of Minnesota. There's no doubt that we can be proud of the incredible work that they are doing in Minnesota. I'm also sponsoring legislation, co-sponsoring legislation that will make cancer treatments more affordable for families and encourage the development of new treatments by redirecting taxpayer funds that are spent on presidential campaigns into childhood cancer research. Mr. Speaker, we all look forward to the day when cancer is 100% treatable in all our children. And that's why I stand alongside doctors and families and, most importantly, cancer patients in the search for a cure, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, freedom of speech and religion and recognition of the God-given dignity of every human life are core principles upon which America was founded. But these inherent freedoms are being attacked. The Southern Poverty Law Center is one of the worst offenders, targeting and persecuting Americans who stand up for their moral convictions. This group routinely attacks mainstream pro-family organizations, slandering them with false accusations of hatred and bigotry. Motivated by their inflammatory rhetoric, a gunman burst into the Family Research Council lobby last year and shot a security guard, later admitting the assault was inspired by the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate list. We cannot let the beacon of freedom known as America become home to hate groups and other extremists, including those who slander the political opponents.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this Constitution Day, I want to applaud those in the armed forces who take a pledge to honor and defend the Constitution at the risk of life and limb. Every generation of Americans has been protected by what Frederick Douglass once called that glorious liberty document. We should take the time today to salute those who defend the Constitution. I fear that sometimes we take for granted the sacrifice that these brave men and women bear. They, like their predecessors, are the ones who allow us to secure our freedoms in the Constitution to pass down to future generations. They are the ones that allow us to gather here today to do the will of the people. They are the reason why the Constitution has lasted over 2 centuries as the prime example in the world of a free government. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Are there further requests for 1 minute speeches? Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker,
Earlier in the session today, we paused in remembrance of those who were killed here in Washington, D.C. yesterday. Yet another tragedy for this nation, another shooting, senseless, rage by some individual. We heard on the floor here a few minutes ago a plea by some of our colleagues to call us to action so that we who represent the millions upon millions of Americans would find within ourselves the courage to take action on wise gun safety legislation, mental health, and other things that we know can help to address the problem that plagues this nation. And so today, as we start this 1 hour, I want to just remind ourselves that we have work to do here. Joining me tonight is Paul Tonko, representative from the state of New York. We often have had the opportunity to speak on the floor about the issues that confront us. And perhaps, Paul, you may want to comment on this tragedy, and then we'll turn to the other issues that we want to take up today.
Thank you, Representative Garamendi, and thank you for bringing us together on what will be thoughtful discussion on how to invest in America and grow the economy and grow job opportunities, create that climate that best cultivates job action and job growth in our society. But just moments ago on the House floor, we held a moment of silence in recognition, in commemoration, in respect for those who gave it their all as federal employees, many federal employees, in that situation. And I just want to attach my comments to those of yours in extending my condolences to the many family members and friends who are so impacted by this tragedy, this horrific act that wipes out their lives prematurely, and may they rest in peace.
I join you in those condolences. Our subject matter for the evening was really going to be about the economy, about income within this nation, or the lack of it. I want to just start by referring to a statement that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made during the economic crisis of the 1930s. And in fact, this statement is etched in the marble at the FDR Memorial here in Washington, D.C. And he said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." The test of our progress. Well, what has been our progress over this last several years? This last week, the economic study of the progress of America since the great crash of 2007 was made public. And there has been progress. There has been economic growth. There has been the creation of wealth. And we have seen progress. But not the kind of progress that FDR talked about in the 30s. What we have seen is exactly the opposite of what he called for, to provide more for those who have little. Here it is, the tale of two Americans, a stunted recovery, but nonetheless a recovery. So where did the economic growth go? Where did the wealth go that was created? Was it to those who have little? No. 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 95% of all of the wealth that this economy created since 2007 and the great crash went to the top 1%. 95% of all of the wealth went to the top 1%. The remaining 99% wound up with 5% of the wealth that the nation's biggest economy created since the crash of 2007. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would not have stood for it, and he didn't. Nor did Bill Clinton. From 1993 to 2000, the economy grew very, very rapidly. The distribution of the wealth that was created during those years went in a remarkably different way than what has happened over the last 5 years. During the Clinton period, 55% of all the wealth that this nation created went to the 99%, the bottom 99%. The top 1% did very well. They got 45% of all of the wealth. You can say that was not enough for the bottom 99%. Now, I would agree. But compared to what's happened over these last 5 years, it's a remarkable improvement on the distribution of wealth. So what is the distribution of wealth? It's not a class struggle. It's about the men and women of this nation that work hard, that get up every day, go to their jobs, as did those 12 people who were killed yesterday here at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. They got up, they went to their job. They worked hard for themselves, for their families, and for this nation. So men and women all across this nation, doing what we want them to do, participating in the society, following the American dream, work hard, play by the rules, get on the economic ladder and climb. Here's what happened to them. Not much. Something is desperately wrong here in America. That the result of 5 years of labor by the 99%, they would find their reward to be 5% of the wealth that was created. We need to address this. And tonight, our subject matter is how we can do that. But before we go to that, I want to put up one more chart and then ask my colleague to join in. What does it mean? What does it really mean down home? What does it mean out there in the subdivision or in the tenements? What does it mean in America when 95% of all of the wealth created winds up in the hands of 1%? Here's what it means. It means that there's hunger in America. It means that mothers and fathers are not able to have a job that they can provide their children with a meal, with food on the table. It means that in this House of Representatives there will be this day, this week, an effort to provide even more hunger in America. More hunger. More children going without food as the supplemental food program is slashed by $40 billion. $4 billion a year, 10 years, $40 billion. So that the 1% can have even more. This is not right. This is not right that in this nation we have hunger. It is not America as it should be. And it certainly is not what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said America should be, when the test of our progress is not whether we add more abundance to those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. We have a challenge here in America. We need to change things. We need to change the public policies that would deny food to hungry children, to parents, to our seniors, to our children in schools. It's time for us to put in place policies that create a real economic growth. Real growth that the working men and women of this nation can share in the economic progress of our nation. And tonight, we're going to spend some time talking about how we can do that. My friend from New York, Paul Tonko.
Well, Representative Garamendi, you have highlighted in a very stark contrast the difference in the thought process and the philosophy of what was then under President FDR, under Franklin Roosevelt, and what is now. And certainly what had happened during the Clinton years, which proved much more progressive in its nature. You know, when we think of that quote of President Roosevelt, where society needed to be tested as to whether or not they were going to add more, add to the abundance of those who have much, that was a tremendous litmus test. It was a challenge to this country to search deep into its moral compass. And what you're highlighting here, Representative Garamendi, is that it's an ebb and flow. It's looking for ways to pay for tax breaks for those who are perched way on the top. And where you talk of that 95, 98% of the growth of the economy going to the top 1%, that's unsustainable. But when you think of the gimmickry that is going on to be able to provide for the cost of such spending, because these tax breaks for those perched on the top is an order of spending, it's done through cuts to programs that speak to hunger, cuts that will impact seniors, cuts that will impact our very young, cuts that will impact our struggling families. Now, there's no mistaking the correlation between tough times and those who are dependent on a number of federal programs. Throughout history, you can suggest through data that are compiled that those charts go upward. When you have tough times, the reliance on several of these programs grows. And it's not unusual that had happened during the recession. And so some struggling families required assistance. But you also have the elderly population that have nutrition inserted as part of their health care formula. It is part of their wellness agenda. If a diabetic does not get the nutritional needs met, there are problems. If there are situations where people are doing without food, it can be the difference between quality of life and sometimes survival because of the absolute need to have a well-balanced nutritional program. And the same is true of our very young. We cannot ask our young children to go without the nutritional values they require or to ask them to study at their best level in a classroom on an empty belly. So the moral compass is very direct here. It points our way and challenges us to take those words uttered decades ago by President Roosevelt, and they speak with greater resonance, deeper, more profound resonance than they had when they were perhaps first uttered by the late former president. We need to take that to mind. We need to have history speak to us. We need to look at what happened when we invested in America, in her working families, in the toughest of times. When we think of the progress made during those Roosevelt years, there is a gentleman who was challenged in his own right and who led this nation, lifted this nation's economy while serving in a wheelchair. That is a powerful statement, one that had progressive outcomes written all over it. And we need to go forward and look at these orders of investment that will grow the economy, at tax policy that draws fundamental fairness so that there isn't this gross disparity between growth for some and denial for others. It's absolutely statistically tracked now from as late as far along as the mid to late 70s to today. You can chart what has happened with some of these efforts to reduce assistance to working families and middle-income community. And it is unsustainable. We cannot grow an economy with these sorts of policies in play. And so tonight, let's look at those investments from education to higher education to infrastructure to advanced manufacturing that is required so as to allow us to compete effectively in a global economy where our manufacturing base can survive if we do it smarter, not necessarily cheaper. If we do it smarter, we will land contracts, grow jobs with the productivity factor that's developed by inserting our policies into the transformation into an advanced manufacturing economy and by providing the investments that will draw policies that are progressive and where resources that will provide a lucrative dividend make them an investment rather than outright spending, as we saw with some of these tax relief measures, which did not produce a growth in the economy and just made life very comfortable for a very relative few. So I think the challenge is before us to go forward and put a sound budget together. None of this kicking the can down the road with continuing resolutions. Let's name the designees to the conference table from each house, from each party. The President has outlined the budget with his administration. The United States Senate has passed its version of a budget. The House has passed its version of a budget. Let's name the participants at the conference table. Let's do it in daylight. Let's flood the lights on the process. Let's show the sharp contrast between various solutions and recommended approaches that will allow the public to be best engaged in the process and to understand the wisdom or lack thereof of some of the moves that are required or requested of us here in the House.
Mr. Tonko, thank you very much. You're quite correct that we need to move in that direction. One of the American economy is about 60–70% based upon consumer purchases of homes and cars and all those other goods. Part of that reason that we're not seeing the kind of economic growth that would normally occur in a recovery is that the 99% don't have money. They lost a great deal of their wealth. Trillions of dollars of their wealth was wiped out in the financial collapse, their pensions, their homes, the equity in their home. And as the economy has recovered, the creation of the growth, the wealth, didn't go to them, so they're not being able to really increase their purchasing power, which has dampened the economy. Now, there are things that we can do, and you were beginning that process, and let's take our way through them. I'm just going to put this back up because this is not just a picture of the distribution of wealth in the economy, that is the economic growth. It's also a picture of why the economy hasn't really returned. There are other factors to be sure, but clearly the absence of purchasing power, that is new wealth in the hands of the 99%, the absence of that has retarded the economic recovery. This is something we've talked about here many, many times, and Mr. Tonko brought this up, many of these issues. We call it the Make It in America agenda. This follows along on President Obama's jobs program. Many of these elements are the same as he proposed. They're displayed a little differently here. Tax policy, critically important. We need to redo our tax policy. Mr. Tonko talked about the tax policy and the effect that we've seen over these many years. But what I'd like to do today is really focus on these other issues, the issue of infrastructure, research, education, labor, and energy. On the labor side, we've talked about that in great detail here. The working men and women, laboring as they are they getting a fair share of the economic growth? The answer is categorically no. Are there policies that can change that? Yes. One of them has been on discussion here in Congress, which is the minimum wage issue. Now, California has a minimum wage law that is before the governor. He's expected to sign it, and that will push the minimum wage up and to about, I think, about $10 an hour, and that will cause the entire wage structure in California to move upward, shifting wealth to the working men and women in California. Whether the nation will follow that, the President has called for an increase in the minimum wage, and that will certainly be helpful in shifting to the working population of this nation a larger share, or at least a fair share, of the growth of the economy. Let's talk about infrastructure for a while. I know this is an issue you were working on, Mr. Tonko, following the floods a year ago. We see those same floods, different floods, but devastating floods occurring in Colorado. You were one of the strong advocates for rebuilding our infrastructure. Why don't you pick that issue up, and let's see if we can talk about how we might be able to accomplish
there again, you know, it's policy or lack thereof that's impacting us heavily. Witnessing some of the unusual 100-year storms, 500-year storms as they're designated, in a rapid succession over the last several years, dating back to the late 80s, but then in rapid succession 2006, 2011, 2012, in upstate New York, in an area that I represent, or just south of me in the area that borders my district, tells me even the nomenclature is ludicrous. It's not a 100 or 500-year storm. It's happening ever so frequently. And it's because we don't embrace some of the science out there that, through data compilation, is begging our attention. If we're going to continue to ignore those impacts of Mother Nature, if we're going to ignore the global warming and impacts of Mother Nature on our infrastructure, we're going to have more and more bills for cleanup. And is it just replacement, or are we talking about reevaluating situations? For instance, some of the electric utility efforts that stayed most abundantly strong were distributed energy projects along the coast in Metro New York with Superstorm Sandy. I saw infrastructure, bridges, displaced by the powerful force of water, in some places equated to the CFS, the cubic feet per second flow of Niagara Falls. And so do you just, if data are telling you that these storms are more and more frequent, that you're going to get this marked extra volume of water, precipitation, do you just replace, or do you take a longer span, a higher, a greater height to that bridge design? These are things that need to be discussed. And again, it's going to be money coming out of the pocket that is required because we're not dealing with the fundamental science that is telling us we should anticipate more and more of these storms. The infrastructure along these efforts, the coastal erosion, is requiring all sorts of improvement to ports. This affects our economy. This requires a master plan. This requires a Make It in America agenda that puts into play investments into our infrastructure to replace what has been damaged with a sound investment, reinvestment here that improves upon a situation rather than just replaces when we know that it will probably not withstand the forces of Mother Nature into the future. So infrastructure is critical, and the millions that we can put to work, Representative Garamendi, with that kind of legislation. The President has called for improvements in our infrastructure that will put millions to work. You know, the best way to resolve a deficit in this country is to have people go to work. And the dignity that comes with that investment in work opportunities is good for working class families across this country. So
Mr. Tonko,
we know what to do. Let's get on with the business.
Well, you and I were talking earlier before we came up here about this. You may want to take up this issue of
sure.
Of what this is an issue of what an infrastructure investment means to growing the economy.
Well, and it speaks also to the order of investment that rather than the order of spending that some might label it. You know, as we improve upon our infrastructure, for every dollar invested, according to Mark Zandi, chief economist with Moody's and former economic advisor to Senator John McCain, $1.57 is realized for every $1 that's invested. To me, that's a lucrative dividend. That is an opportunity for us to grow the economy by investing dollars with the anticipation that there will be a good return on that investment. That's how it works. That's the beauty of building. I think it's what President Roosevelt saw in the 30s and 40s. He saw this opportunity to respond to the needs of America. Public works projects that were absolutely essential. Building water treatment centers, building schools and infrastructure, roads and the like. President Eisenhower saw the beauty of an interstate highway system, putting people to work, making strong opportunities available for commerce. These are the fundamental needs of a sophisticated society. It's the needs of certainly America in a modern age innovation economy. So the roads and bridges as traditional sources, water treatment facilities, utility grid upgrades, telecommunications. This goes well into the new technology spheres of today, where you wire communities and neighborhoods for business. There is a dire need for that sort of activity. That puts people to work. That's an investment that will draw a rate of return on the dollars invested in those projects. And that's what makes the wisdom of that approach very remarkably sound and comprehensible. I think that certainly history has taught us well. And for us to ignore history at a moment when we're still struggling with this comeback, yes, it's been a steady growth in private sector jobs, but let's face it, many propositions sent to the House and to the United States Senate by the chief executive, by the president, have been denied simply by means of the source from whom they're coming. Let's be frank about this. And this is not the time to play personality warfare. It's the time to do sound, progressive policies that provide for then good politics, bipartisan politics for this nation and her people and her working families. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. Let's go forward, invest in our manufacturing base, innovation economy, clean energy economy, which require the tools of modern-day economy so that we can build it cheaper and smarter, perhaps, but definitely cheaper. And that's how you land those contracts in the international marketplace. So I am hopeful that our best days, Representative Garamendi, lie ahead if we have the tenacity, if we have the integrity to go forward with what are the soundness of policies and the boldness of investment that are done, that are placed on the table with the full anticipation and expectation that there is a reasonable rate of return on that investment.
Well, we know that there's an immediate return on the investment in infrastructure. Mark Zandi laid it out there. You invest $1 in infrastructure now, and you get back $1.57. And you've got somebody working immediately. They become a taxpayer rather than a tax receiver. So there's some real opportunities here. I want to just take a couple of seconds. I was reading the Wall Street Journal as I was flying from California today, and there was an article by Martin Feldstein, who was Ronald Reagan's chief economic advisor. And he focused in this article on several things, but it was growing the economy. How do you get the economy growing? And he specifically talked about infrastructure. He talked about infrastructure as a way to immediately employ people. We certainly agree with that. And it's also a way you lay the foundation for future economic growth, because that infrastructure is then available for the future. I was in Fresno, California a while, I guess 2 or 3 years ago, and went down to the high school to talk at an educational conference there, and they were setting this conference in an auditorium that was built by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in the Roosevelt period, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt period. So here was this wonderful auditorium laid out there. We were using it 80 years later, 70 years later. And you go, wow, there's an infrastructure investment in education. And so it is. By building this infrastructure, we employ people immediately, and we then have the foundation for future economic growth. You mentioned the water system, sanitation, electrical energy systems, roads, highways, and the like. And it's jobs today. I want to talk about how we can finance.
And don't forget our ports, our rail.
Well, let's not forget,
airports.
This is not new economics. George Washington, in his first month in office, this is the first president, folks. His first month in office turned to Alexander Hamilton, his Treasury Secretary, and said, develop an economic policy. Hamilton came back a couple of months later, not with a report that we would have, several thousand pages, but maybe, I don't know, 50 or 60 pages, and he laid out an economic policy. Number one on his agenda was to build America's infrastructure, ports, canals. I know you're going to launch into the Erie Canal, that I've mentioned canals, which is your favorite subject. And he also talked about roads. He talked about laying down the infrastructure for the growth of the economy. Before we get to your Erie Canal, I want to talk about something that actually happened. This is a good thing. This is a very good thing. In the stimulus bill, which, by the way, did work, not as robust as we would have liked, but it did work, there was a provision to build locomotives for Amtrak. I think about $800 million over a period of years would be spent on building locomotives for the East Coast. This is so you can get home, Mr. Tonko, on the East Coast here. These locomotives were to be 100% American-made. I don't know who wrote that provision, but it was one of the very few provisions in the stimulus bill that said, make it in America. 100% American-made. Siemens, a German company, one of the big international industrial companies, said, $800 million. Ooh, you have to make it in America. Okay. Siemens had a factory in Sacramento, California to manufacture light rail cars, you know, streetcars and the like. They got this contract. This is the first locomotive made in America by Siemens under that stimulus provision. They're going to make, I think, 80 of these over the period of the next several years, 100% American-made. And now across the United States, as a result of this infrastructure investment, we're beginning to see companies in a supply chain, some that are making the wheels, the truck underneath, which is where the wheels attach to the locomotive, the facility up on top that attaches to the electric lines. All of this American-made, 100% American-made. And by the way, I have a piece of legislation in that would continue that says if you're going to spend your tax money on transportation systems, highways, bridges, locomotives and the like, it's going to be your tax money used to buy American-made equipment. Just like George Washington said we ought to do it.
Well, you know, it does go back to our humble beginnings, and it's, again, history instructs us. History, if we allow it, will guide us in some of our toughest times. We realized some of our greatest, most monumental success stories. And, you know, you did mention the canal, which, for my area, I see the 20th Congressional District that I represent as a donor area to that canal. But I just want to make this factoid available. In those times, people look back and they think, well, what a wonderful project, and it probably sailed through. No, it met with great controversy. And it was proposed because of economic difficult times. And here was a vision. That's leadership. Give us the vision of how you can grow the economy. What can we do that is strong and forceful and will change the outcomes out there? And it was this connection of a port in a little town called New York that gave birth to a necklace of communities called mill towns in upstate New York that became epicenters of invention and innovation. That all came about with a struggle to find the investment available to build this canal. So the struggle will always be there.
What was that canal?
The Erie Canal.
Oh, the Erie Canal.
Erie Canal, barge canal history, which is wonderful. But my point here is that there will always be struggle for issues like this. There will be a counterforce to every force of perceived good that can happen. But that doesn't mean we should walk away because the climate or the environment is difficult. We go forward. We know what has to be done. History has been instructing us here. Science, through data compilation, is reminding us of some very torturous outcomes that have been part of very atypical storms. Superstorm Sandy, which gripped the entire Northeast, was atypical. Tropical storms and hurricanes in upstate New York, unheard of, that produced all sorts of damage, including loss of life, loss of farmland, valuable farmland, loss of businesses, loss of homes, in some ways totally swept away by the forces of water. That is a difficult situation that needs to be addressed with infrastructure improvements. If we do not take this to heart and mind, we will be, I believe, a lesser society for not having paid strict attention to both science and history, which ought to guide us.
Well, if you take a look at Superstorm Sandy, I don't know what they're going to call the storm that is occurring in Colorado, but we're also seeing the necessity to prepare for climate change and these new, very strong, very dangerous storms that we now have seen repeated. There's going to be a major infrastructure investment rebuilding Colorado, just as there was a major infrastructure investment in rebuilding the East Coast following Superstorm Sandy. As that investment is made, we will see the economy begin to pick up as men and women return to work. If we take what I think we ought to do is to spend that money on American-made concrete and steel and the like as we rebuild these necessary infrastructure works, we will add to the economic potential of that rebuilding. Now, how are we going to pay for it? Let's get down to what has been, I think, the most common complaint here. Oh, you're just going to borrow the money and we're going to run up the deficit. Well, Martin Feldstein was very clear today that if you make an investment in infrastructure, you're going to immediately employ people and you will be making a major step towards solving the deficit problem. You do that now, he said. Begin that investment now. Yes, you're going to borrow the money, not all of it, and there are ways that we can get that we'll deal with that, but there is a necessity of enhancing the economy. His suggestion was the infrastructure as one of the principal ways of doing that. Now, We have ways of financing this. It's been discussed forever, dating back to the mid and early 90s, that we ought to have an infrastructure bank. The Europeans have an infrastructure bank. It's proved to be very successful. The money goes out to build infrastructure. The repayment is made by bridge tolls, by fees on roads, by canal fees, other kinds of fees. That money comes back. It's circulated. The President has called for an infrastructure bank, taking an idea that's been before Congress for the last 20 years, and he said, let's do it. Let's do it. We can borrow money at the federal level still less than 3%, sometimes 2%. Put that into an infrastructure bank, invite the private sector pension funds and others to become part of that bank, and then lend that money out to those projects that have a cash flow, toll bridges, sanitation projects, waterworks, other kinds of things, so that we can get this economy moving. We also had a program coming out of the stimulus bill called Build America Bonds, BABs, Build America Bonds. Those lasted all of 2 years, and then our colleagues here refused to reenact the Build America bonds. These are other ways in which local entities can borrow the money and build the infrastructure and get their economy going. And furthermore, laying the foundation for future economic growth. You can't build a city on yesterday's infrastructure. You need to replace it, to be sure, and this is part of the problem in our cities, the aging infrastructure, the waterworks, the sanitation system, and the rest. We need to rebuild that, but you also need to expand the infrastructure. One final way that we can talk about financing this is how we do spend the tax revenue that does come in to the American Treasury. Right now, Congress is debating on how to spend money for the next fiscal year, which begins on October the 1st. How are we going to spend it? Part of that appropriation process is to appropriate $87 billion for the Afghanistan war in the coming year, October 1st through the 2014 year until September 30th. $87 billion for Afghanistan. How much money for flood protection in Colorado? Flood protection in my district? Flood protection across the eastern seaboard to build the seawalls? Virtually nothing. But $87 billion for Afghanistan. For what? For what? To build facilities that we will either destroy as we leave or will be destroyed shortly after we leave? $7 billion for the Afghan National Army, $2.5 billion of which is for good things to be done, no line items, no particular knowledge about what they're going to spend that money on. I suspect most of it's going to wind up in some bank account by some crook in the Bahrain banks. $2.5 billion. What could we do with $2.5 billion here in America? And by the way, we're drawing down the troops in Afghanistan. We're actually going to spend more money in Afghanistan next year than we are this year, even though we have 60% less troops in Afghanistan. We're making choices. Your representatives, 435 of us and 100 members of the Senate, are making choices about how your money is going to be spent. And by the way, I haven't talked about the nuclear bombs. 5,000 of them. We're going to rebuild them. Now, there's a good investment. Really? I don't think so. Not when the levees in my district can't be rebuilt to protect my citizens from floods, to rebuild a nuclear weapon that we don't need in the first place. No, I don't think so. So we're making choices. We're making choices for you, the American taxpayers, about how your money is going to be spent. For me, I want to spend it in America. I want to spend it in American-made goods and equipment, not on products from China, as happened with the newly reopened San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. Steel from China, not from America. I want that money spent here, and I want that money spent on our infrastructure, on our education, on research, energy projects. We're going to make choices. We're making those choices right now. We're up against the wall. By the end of this month, September 30th, the government runs out of money. Where are we going to spend it? Or are we going to spend it at all? We're just going to shut down government? I don't know. I'm worried. I'm worried about the choices that we're making. I'm worried about more expenditure in Afghanistan and not here at home. I'm worried about rebuilding all these nuclear weapons that, God willing, we'll never use. Choices. Can we actually build America? Can we find the willingness to create an infrastructure bank? Can we find the willingness to bring the money back home and spend it here to build this economy? Because ultimately, as our Joint Chiefs of Staff has said repeatedly, it's the American economy. Without that strength, there won't be military strength. I've gone on too far here. Mr. Tonko, let's begin to wrap this up.
Yeah,
and,
in fact, I will offer my closing comments here. Representative Garamendi, you know, I think what you talk about in choices are exactly what a budget is about. It's the priorities we establish in a bipartisan fashion, a bicameral way, that enable us to go forward with the best blueprint that grows the most hope and promise for this nation. If we can deliver that hope, we've done our job. This is about investing in the American dream. It's about responding to that old adage within this nation that you tether that American dream here in this wonderful nation where people rightfully anticipate that if they play by the rules, they roll up their sleeves, they invest their talents and their skills and their intellect and their passions into work, they rightfully anticipate to taste success, and that allows them to have an equal shot at opportunity in this nation. That has not been the guiding force. We have had an unlevel playing field. We have made choices that have penalized the great percentage of Americans. 95 to 98% of Americans have been impacted by some of these choices and priorities to the negative. And so it's important for us, I believe, to offer that dream, that American dream, the underpinnings of support that it rightfully requires. The cost of a college education ought to be addressed by Washington. We need to forcefully come up with a plan that reduces that cost, because that higher ed opportunity, those apprenticeship programs are training the workforce of tomorrow. And without that workforce, without that human infrastructure, we are less robust in our competitive force. What about the investment, as Representative Garamendi mentioned, in infrastructure? What about that infrastructure bill that has worked well in sections of the globe? Why not go forward with that opportunity so that small business can prosper in that outcome? The great engine of this economy, of this comeback, has been small business growth. Jobs provided by those business citizens who are tethered to the community, who have enabled women and men in all sections of this country to draw a paycheck through some sort of commitment that they make as a small business person, giving that work opportunity to their neighbors and to the communities that they call home. That's the strength that we need for small business, so that we can continue to be that engine of comeback. That comeback scenario is incredibly valuable to this nation. And what about going forward with the commitment to the soundness of that moral compass that should guide us? Forever there will be those who require justice in our society, economic and social justice. We're reminded by our founding parents that we're in search of a more perfect union. Well, the imperfections need to be addressed by those priorities that are established by us, the people's representatives in this House and in the Senate and in the White House. All of us working in a bicameral, bipartisan way to put aside petty partisan differences, to put aside personality warfare, and make certain we go forward with an agenda that is truly all-American, driven, ignited, and lifted by the American dream. Our days, Representative Garamendi, that lie ahead hold great promise, great hope. I'm convinced that our best days lie ahead if we allow history and science to instruct us and to reach our hearts, our souls, our minds as we go forward with the development of a budget that will be sound and reflective of all of America, with every one of her daughters and sons reflected in those decisions. So I thank you for bringing us together this evening.
Mr. Tonko, thank you very, very much. Indeed, our best days are ahead of us. Even in the dismal days of the Great Depression in the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt laid it out very clearly when he said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." When 95% of the wealth that's been generated over the last 5 years winds up with 1%, we got a problem, because the economy isn't going to grow. And what will happen is this: hunger in America. Later this week, we'll take up the nutrition bill for this nation. And there are those who want to remove $40 billion from the nutrition programs for our children, for our seniors, for those that are unemployed, for those that are searching for work. We can do better. We really can. The best days are ahead of us if this Congress and the Senate, together with the President, work together and lay out those plans that have informed us historically that they work. Investment. Investment in those things that make America strong. Infrastructure, research, education. Those are things that are timeless and work year after year. There are also things that have recently been reduced and cut. We can't let this happen in America. We cannot allow that to happen. Mr. Speaker, with that, I think it's time to yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be standing before the House this evening to talk about a very, very important issue, an issue that is important not only to my constituents in eastern and southeastern Ohio, but to Americans across the nation. And the issue is the survival of the coal industry. Coal has provided America's energy engine for generations and can for many future generations if we but have policies out of this administration that reflect the value that the coal industry has meant to America and the future that it has in front of us. Coal is an abundant, affordable, and reliable form of energy. Coal, directly or indirectly, employs nearly 800,000 Americans and supplies approximately 40% of our nation's power generation. Coal mining employees across my district number in the thousands in eastern and southeastern Ohio. It also provides nearly 80% of Ohio's electricity, and it's the energy engine for Ohio's manufacturing industry, which so many of my constituents depend on for their livelihood. And I'm very proud to be joined tonight, Mr. Speaker, by some of my colleagues who are equally passionate about the coal industry and its value to America, both in the past and in the future. And at this point, I'd like to recognize my friend and colleague from the great state of Kentucky, the 6th District Representative Andy Barr.
I thank the gentleman, my friend from Ohio, for yielding and for organizing this special order on coal. This fall marks the 5th anniversary of the financial crisis. We remain burdened by a weak economic recovery, with unemployment still lingering above 7%. 2/3 of the American people living paycheck to paycheck, and only 58% of the working-age population in this country employed. But this does not seem to concern this president or this administration. Unable to wage a war in Syria due to immense public opposition, the president, for some reason, seems intent on conducting a war on jobs. Whether it's driving up the cost of health care with the disastrous Affordable Care Act, or burdening community banks with mountains of bureaucratic red tape from the Dodd-Frank Act, this administration is seemingly intent on doing everything in its power to ensure this recovery remains slow and painful. The finalization of the new source performance standards rules from the EPA for greenhouse gas emissions this week will represent the latest and perhaps the most damaging barrage in this war on jobs. This regulatory carbon tax is the keystone of a radical environmental agenda, the disastrous results of which are already known in my district of central and eastern Kentucky. The consequences of these regulations have echoed throughout the hills of Appalachia, and they will reverberate across the country in years to come. The new source performance standards will finish the job that a deadlocked permitting process and multi-billion-dollar regulations like the Utility MACT have started, killing the coal industry and driving up the cost of energy, a top-line budget item for families already struggling to get by in this president's economy. But then no one should be surprised. This is the one promise the president made and has kept. When running in 2008, President Obama, then candidate Obama, said his policies would make the cost of electricity necessarily skyrocket. More recently, White House climate advisor Daniel Schrag recently admitted this administration's previously only thinly veiled position. Mr. Schrag said famously now, quote, "War on coal is exactly what is needed," unquote. Mr. Speaker, I can't think of another example of a presidential administration pledging to put hard-working Americans in a centuries-old industry totally out of work, apparently for the crime of providing low-cost energy that drives the engine of our economy. The damage of these policies is already clear in Kentucky. Just yesterday, another 525 coal miners employed at 3 East Kentucky mines operated by the James River Coal Company were given pink slips. My heart goes out to these miners and to their families, and I have met some of these people. And they're just trying to follow their ancestors by digging up a piece of the American dream, the Appalachian foothills. Last month, the Commonwealth of Kentucky released its statistics on the health of the coal industry for the second quarter of this year. And the story they tell is dire, even before yesterday's news of another 525 layoffs. Eastern Kentucky coal mines, facing the brunt of this president's regulatory overreach, shed another 851 jobs last quarter, leaving the total number of Kentuckians employed at the mines at 12,342. That is the lowest number since Kentucky began keeping such statistics in 1927. Eastern Kentucky coal production is down a whopping 41.4% in just the last 2 years. And with those reductions, we have lost over 5,700 mining jobs. And now, the new source performance standards will prohibit coal from even competing in the energy marketplace. Even though the final regulations have now been delayed a year due to industry and public opposition, as so often before, this administration has brushed those concerns aside and proceeded apace. The EPA even forecasts, given the regulatory environment, that there will be no new coal plants built after this year. Rather than phasing in rules to allow all types of fuel to adapt, these regulations on new and existing plants single out coal, stifling the promise of carbon capture in its crib, a technology that could have provided the United States with a revolutionary technology on the magnitude of hydraulic fracturing that could have changed the course and shape of our economy, driven exports, and paid real benefits in terms of carbon emissions reductions. But instead, the United States will endure unilateral economic disarmament while our international competitors continue to pursue growth-oriented energy policies. Over the next few years, as these policies take hold, the rest of the country will be made aware of this disaster that is already taking place in Appalachia. Already, 1/5 of the nation's coal-fired power plants, 204 plants across 25 states, closed between 2009 and 2012. The rest will shutter prematurely in the years following implementation of the new source performance standards. 7 EPA regulations already proposed over the last 4 years are forecast to cost $16.7 billion annually once fully implemented. The new source performance standards will trump even that figure, constituting the largest energy tax of all time, implemented by regulatory fiat without the consent of the people's elected representatives in Congress. That's because this president's own party couldn't enact this radical environmental agenda through cap and trade in the first 2 years of this president's administration. The loss of 69,000 megawatts of coal-fired power will ripple through the economy, costing an estimated 887,000 jobs in the mining, utility, shipping, and manufacturing sectors per year. The President had pledged to spur growth in manufacturing and low energy costs at home, coupled with rising wages in countries like China and India, promised to restore our competitive advantage in manufacturing. But the new source performance standards will quickly put an end to those prospects. Mr. Speaker, the United States has 250 years' worth of coal reserves at current consumption rates that could, if utilized, provide affordable energy and high-tech manufacturing feedstocks. But the President isn't interested in playing this ace up America's sleeve. Instead, he wants to stay the course on a disastrous energy rationing policy that has already put thousands in the unemployment lines in my neck of the woods in Kentucky and all throughout central Appalachia, and will put hundreds of thousands of more hard-working Americans there in the years to come. So I urge the President to abandon these disastrous, job-killing policies and to come to Congress to work on a plan that will relieve energy costs for our families, put the American people back to work, and protect the environment. Otherwise, this week's announcement of these new source performance standards will demonstrate a willful denial of these ambitions and a ruthless attack on a centuries-old industry that has provided jobs and economic opportunity for thousands of Americans. And I want to end my comments this evening by telling a story that illustrates the human cost and the human dimension of this administration's war on coal. In the eastern edge of my district sits a small town of Campton, Kentucky, in Wolfe County, Kentucky. And when I was home during the August recess, I went there and had a town hall meeting to listen to the concerns of people who are struggling. And I met a young woman by the name of Sally. And she came up to me after the town hall meeting with tears welling up in her eyes. And she looked at me and she said, "My husband just lost his job in the coal mines. He's a coal miner. He lost his job because the Environmental Protection Agency would not issue a coal mining permit to his employer. And as a result, they had to lay off all of the coal miners, including my husband," is what this woman told me. And she said, "Here's the problem. My children need to go back to school. It's August, and it's time to go back to school, and they're growing up, and they don't have shoes. They've grown out of their shoes. And so I don't know what to do because we can't afford shoes. So I went ahead and bought them flip-flops so that they wouldn't be embarrassed to go back to school." Imagine that. Politicians and bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., putting this working family in central Appalachia in that kind of economic distress so that they can't even afford shoes for their children. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, a supporter of this administration or not. It is fundamentally wrong. It is fundamentally immoral for the federal government to put working American families into economic distress. And so I call on my colleagues in Congress to stand firm and stand in opposition to this radical agenda which is destroying jobs, destroying opportunity, and destroying the American dream. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank our colleague for yielding back. I think you can see, Mr. Speaker, the passion that's coming to Washington to advocate on the part of the coal industry. We're not just talking about a black rock that's dug out of the ground. We're talking about lives. We're talking about American lives. We're talking about jobs and the ability to put food on the table, to put clothes on our children, to provide a manufacturing base so that Americans have somewhere to work, and to do what America knows how to do best, innovate and compete and solve problems. I'm proud now to turn over some time to another one of our colleagues, Representative Kevin Cramer from the great state of North Dakota.
Thank you very much. I thank my colleague and friend from Ohio for leading this important discussion on this very important and somewhat scary week. Mr. Speaker, I love the opportunity to tell the story of North Dakota. You know, a lot of people think of North Dakota these days as just an oil-producing state out there somewhere in the Wild West. And while we're the second leading producer of oil, and we're rather proud of how well we do it, long before that, even long before North Dakota was one of the 10 top producers of wind energy, long before that, North Dakota was producing electricity by burning coal. In fact, for decades, North Dakota has been generating electricity burning coal. In fact, at the current burn rate, there's an 800-year supply of lignite coal under our prairies. And prior to being elected to this great institution of the People's House, I was a public service commissioner for 10 years and the portfolio of coal mining in our state. I got to oversee the data collection, the pre-mine permitting, the permitting of the mine, the inspections of the mines, the releasing of the bond at the end of the life of the mine. North Dakota companies mine over 30 million tons of coal every year, Mr. Speaker, generating about 5,000 megawatts of electricity, and currently we have about 120,000 acres under permit for coal mining in our state. It's very important to North Dakota as it is to the rest of our nation. The lignite industry in North Dakota, a state of fewer than 700,000 citizens, employs more than 28,000 of those 700,000 people and has an annual economic impact in our little state of $3 billion and generates over $100 million of tax revenue to help fund the priorities of our state. To provide some perspective, Mr. Speaker, on the wage impact of the industry in North Dakota, 2 counties, Mercer and Oliver counties, are 3 coal mines and 5 generating plants. And they're 2 counties with the highest wages of any county in our state, and we have a state with very high wages. But those direct economic benefits are just a small part of our story. Because you see, 79% of North Dakota's lignite is used to generate electricity for over 2 million citizens in the upper Midwest. 13.5% is used to generate synthetic natural gas that is piped to over 400,000 homes in the East. And every time I have this opportunity to address the House, I like to tell a little piece of the story. You see, 7.5% of that coal is used to generate fertilizer for our #1 industry, agriculture. It's a great part of our culture. It's what I believe makes us very good at coal mining. It's those agricultural roots. Let's talk about electricity generation for a moment. That's under such attack today. No industry in America is more under attack today than this by this administration. We're home to 7 plants, as I said, owned by rural electric cooperatives, investor-owned utilities, and provides low-cost electricity to our region. And beyond the direct employment of the high-paying jobs in this industry by the coal mines, the generation plants, the transmission companies, the utilities, the distribution companies, low-cost coal provides the region with some of the cheapest utility rates in the country. In fact, just today I printed out the most recent Electric Power Monthly report on the average retail price of electricity by state year-to-date, and North Dakota and the state of Washington have the lowest retail prices of any state in the country. Can you imagine what a tremendous advantage that is in the global marketplace when you're trying to attract other industries? As my colleague from Kentucky talked about, the opportunity for manufacturing in other industries. Now, we're also home to the Great Plains Synfuels plant, which takes our coal and turns it into gas that's used by homes and industry. And in the process of gasifying that coal, 50% of it is captured. The carbon is captured and then shipped via pipeline to Saskatchewan for tertiary oil recovery. So we capture half of the carbon and then inject it into old oil wells and generate more oil from it. Long before carbon capture and sequestration was cool, North Dakota innovators saw it as a commercially viable byproduct of energy development. Now, all that's going to get squashed by these rules that we're hearing about this week. Another innovation of our coal is that we use the ash from the plants, a byproduct of the power plants. Instead of it being emitted out of the stacks, it's collected. And other entrepreneurial-minded individuals have discovered productive ways to utilize the coal ash instead of sending it to landfill. It creates a stronger, longer-lasting, and easier-to-work with concrete that's used in our nation's infrastructure, something that we need very badly these days. It's used in paint, insulation for stoves and refrigerators, ceiling and floor tiles, lumber, bricks and masonry, shingles and roofing materials. This is a byproduct, not a waste product. And it's certainly safe. It's used to make better bridges like the new I-35 bridge in Minneapolis, better footings for wind towers. The many, many wind towers in North Dakota are actually attached to coal ash concrete. And their ability to sell this byproduct allows our utilities to keep electricity rates low for everyone. But you might ask, what of the environment? After all, it's the air, land, and water that concerns the magnitude of rules and regulations coming out they're coming at our industries with such zeal out of this administration. I love talking about our environment in North Dakota. I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, and to our colleagues that very few places on earth are cleaner and greener than the state of North Dakota. With regard to our air, you might assume that a state with 7 power plants would have dirty air, but no, we're one of very few states that meet all ambient air quality standards as prescribed by the EPA. We're very proud of that. Oh, and by the way, remember those 2 counties, Mercer and Oliver, with the 5 power plants and the 3 coal mines? Once again this year, they received an A grade from the American Lung Association for their clean air in their annual report for 2012. But perhaps the area I'm most proud of is the reclamation of our mined lands. Before the federal government passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, the state of North Dakota passed its own reclamation laws, which were stricter, higher standards. We return our land to pre-mining use. I wish every member of Congress could come to North Dakota. I wish our president could come to North Dakota and see how good America could be and see how we reclaim our land, because we love our land. We're farmers and ranchers. Our mines take great pride in and invest vast resources in protecting our environment, their environment. Our companies have won many awards for stewardship. And you see, coal miners and utility company employees not only enjoy high-paying jobs, but they live there. They breathe the air. They drink the water. They farm the land. They're not just farmers and engineers, they're accountants, machinery operators, environmental scientists, rangeland biologists, truck drivers. The care of our natural resources is more important to us than it is to the EPA, quite honestly, and we do it quite well. We're a place made up of people who have proven for centuries you don't have to compromise quality of life for a high standard of living. We are an all-the-above state, and I'm very, very proud of it. And I'm proud to be here with you, my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, and to tell the story one more time about the importance of this industry. And if a war on coal is what's being waged, then we better be armed for the war, because it's worth fighting for. It's for our future. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and the point that you just made and that our colleague from Kentucky made. It's not simply a war on coal. It's a war on American jobs. It's a war on the American way of life. We have to stand. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud now to yield some time to another one of our colleagues who no one in the House knows more about the impacts of the coal industry to the economy of her state, her region, than does our colleague from West Virginia, Representative Shelley Moore Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Ohio for having a special order to talk about coal, to talk about energy, to talk about jobs, to talk about quality of life in our states, North Dakota, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia. West Virginia is the second largest coal-producing state in the country, and it is part of who we are and has been for many, many years. And living in West Virginia and being home as we were in August, there's a lot of pessimism in the entire state. It's not just about coal. If you're a coal miner or a directly involved, it's the whole community, it's the whole area, it's the whole region. And there's a feeling that the President, through his policies, has really picked winners and losers in this country. And our region is going to lose. And the job issue, we're seeing hundreds of jobs. We just had a mine close last week or week before, 250 miners. But then that's the transportation, the truck driver, the stop-and-go owner, the oil and gas marketer, the electrician, the pipes, all the things that the equipment manufacturers, everything. It's not just about those 250 jobs. It's a multiplying effect in our region of West Virginia. The abundance of coal in West Virginia and nationwide gives us real potential. You know, we get criticized, oh, you're fighting an old fight. That fight's, you know, it's no longer part of the future. We got to make it a part of the future, because it makes good sense. Producing more domestic energy means reliable, it means affordable supply of power and energy. I think about a state like mine that has a lot of folks who live on fixed incomes, a lot of older folks. When it comes to the end of the month and they see their electric bill, they're having trouble now meeting that challenge of paying for that, making choices of medicine or food or you know, food for their pets or whatever's important to them because of the high cost now. That's just going to go up and up and up if we disenfranchise ourselves in this country of our most abundant resource, and that being coal. Let's talk about the tax revenues that are lost to all the counties, the school systems in our state. If you don't have the tax revenues in our state that coal produces and energy produces, whether it's natural gas, we all got a lot of natural gas in our states too. We're blessed with that. But if we don't have the the tax revenues there, this just wounds county commissioners, wounds county boards of education. And that to me is one of the, not unintended, but one of the consequences that never gets talked about, that really will harm a way of life, a future for the children. So let's talk about the potential. We've been exporting a lot of coal. And importing, you know, and by doing that, we create jobs because we're exporting our coal. And I see nothing wrong with exporting coal to our allies because exporting energy means we're producing the resource. Earlier this year, Bloomberg News reported that Germany will start up more coal-fired power stations this year than at any time in the past 20 years. And when we think about Germany, we think about somebody who's environmentally conscious. They have a very healthy green party over there. They're very considered to be very cutting edge when it comes to conservation and clean energy. Yet they're building more coal-fired power plants in their country than they have over the last 25 years. During the first campaign, the president said that if you build a coal-fired power plant, we will bankrupt you. We've all seen the tape. And on Friday, that's what his statement's going to be from the EPA. It will be impossible to build a new coal-fired power plant, or it will bankrupt you if you try to do it. And one of his major advisors has said that a war on coal is exactly what this country needs. How can you say a war on an industry that employs thousands of people in the heartland of our country and thousands more in ancillary businesses? And it's a way of life. It's domestic energy. The administration supports this attack on hardworking people in an industry that provides good jobs and back to the affordable energy, not just for our folks on fixed incomes, but for our manufacturers, our small businesses. Cheaper, affordable energy is going to create jobs in other industries as well, and it has. You don't have to look too far to see the administration's attack on coal. We know about the EPA's unprecedented action of retroactively pulling a validly issued clean water permit. That was shocking on the face of it. They said, oh, we've done that before. Well, when you look at it, maybe once, maybe a long time ago, but this was a 10-year process, millions of dollars to get this permit that was yanked out from under this company. And who's going to invest in an industry when you're in danger of losing a permit retroactively after you've jumped through all the hoops, met all the standards, worked with the Corps, done all the things that you're supposed to do, and still this administration will come back and take your permit back? The administration has attacked the use of coal. Recent figures say that 295 coal units across 33 states are closing, and they're closing in our states, and we can already see it. And it's a source of great concern. In 2012, the EPA proposed a new source performance standard. They kind of backed off from it, but it would place coal plants and large natural gas plants under the same standard for carbon dioxide emissions, 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. Well, what we're hearing early reports is they're going to create two standards. But the standard for coal is going to be unmeetable because the carbon capture and sequestration, the technology's not there. This is where I think if we look at the future, where the real future lies for our abundant resource, coal. But earlier this year, they scrapped the 2012 proposal, and the President instructed revised standards. But basically what we're going to see on Friday is it's the same thing. It's like Groundhog Day. Same thing, same rhetoric, same standards, same results. Lost jobs, higher utility costs, seniors and others on fixed incomes worried about how they're going to heat their homes or cool them in the hot summers. All these things are very, very daunting in my state of West Virginia. The truth is that without new performance standards, carbon dioxide emission generation in the United States are falling. Let's talk about the rest of the world. At the same time, global emissions have increased by 1.4%. So if the administration wants to impose carbon dioxide standards and regulations that will harm the American economy, then at a minimum it should act as part of an agreement with other countries. The Senate unanimously took that position in 1997 when it passed a resolution sponsored by then Senator Robert C. Byrd from West Virginia and current Obama Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, which said that the United States should not ratify the Kyoto Treaty unless specific standards were agreed upon to limit emissions by developing countries. The Byrd-Hagel principle was common sense in 1997, and it remains so today. For that reason, I will be introducing legislation that would delay the implementation of the new source rules for coal plants unless other countries that account for 80% of the total non-USA carbon dioxide emission standards enact those standards so that we are not disadvantaging our workers, our jobs, our economy, our seniors, are folks who have manufacturing jobs and small businesses. The American people want us to work together. They really do. I mean, we hear that when we're out. It's Republicans, Democrats, independents, non-parties, old, young, educated, less educated, blue-collar, white-collar. They want us to work together. They want common-sense policies. They want an energy policy that creates jobs, that includes everything, that is an all-of-the-above energy plan. And that's what we want, and that's what we're fighting for. The President stood up here in January and said he was for all of the above energy. On Friday, he's going to say all of the above except coal, which is abundant in the heartland of America. So with that, I would urge my colleagues on the floor tonight to think about coal and how it you know, I think, and I know I'm running short on my time, but I want to say that some states do not realize what their portfolio is in coal. So I looked up Florida. 22% of the energy that is the power generation in Florida, 22% of that is coal. Yet you hear many of the Florida delegation just right on board with the climate change philosophy of this president. Their renewable portfolio in the Sunshine State is slightly over 2%. The renewable portfolio in the state of West Virginia, who has some of the most abundant resources in the country, is at least twice that. So it goes back to, actually, do what you say and say what you do. And so I think that we need to work with our colleagues, educate our colleagues about what a great role coal plays across this country. Even if you don't mine it in your region, you're using it, you're powering it. Your seniors in Florida are using it to cool themselves down on a hot summer day. And so with that, I would say I look forward with dread on Friday to see what the new EPA administrator has come forward with, because I feel that it's going to pick winners and losers in this country, and that our region, and really our own domestic energy supply, and in some ways our domestic energy security, is going to be disadvantaged. And that, to me, in a time of high unemployment, in a time of more part-time jobs being created than full-time, we're going to turn our back on an industry that looks to the future to do it better, to do it cleaner, to do it more efficiently, to do it with higher technology, to do it with better research, to do it with education, to employ the next generation in an industry that's been part of the backbone of this country and certainly of our region. So with that, I yield back and thank the gentleman for having me.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding back, and certainly we can see the passion that she brings to the table as well. I think one of the things that is important for the American people to understand is this notion of energy independence and security. We hear those terms a lot, but not everybody understands what those terms really mean and how it affects them, their families, their future. And I think there's some lessons that can be learned about America's past that would help us understand how energy independence and security might affect our future. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and I think to do so, I want to set the stage just a little bit by taking us back to March of 2011, when right here in this chamber, the Prime Minister of Australia addressed a joint session of Congress. She came to this chamber and she started her speech off by saying, I remember being a young girl, sitting on my living room floor watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon, thinking to myself, wow, those Americans can do anything. She went on to talk about America's and Australia's engagement in world issues, how America stood alongside of and often in front of Australia during World War II. At the end of her speech, she summarized by saying, I'm not that young girl anymore. Today I'm the Prime Minister of our country. And yet still today I believe that Americans can do anything. And when she said that phrase the second time, this notion that Americans can do anything, you could have almost heard a pin drop in this chamber. There was a hush as members from the Senate, from the President's cabinet, dignitaries, military leaders, members of the House, sort of took a collective cleansing breath, sucking that air in, that notion that Americans can do anything. It's not like we don't believe it. It's certainly not that we haven't proven it, but we don't hear it these days. And we're certainly not teaching it to future generations the way we once did. You see, when President Kennedy launched us on that great vision to put a man on the moon in 10 years, he engaged every fabric of our society, our scientific community, our technological community, our academic community, our military, our economic will, our political will. And he said before the American people, he said, we're not doing these things because they're easy. In fact, we're doing these things because they're hard. And because by doing these things, we're going to invent and innovate and discover things that we might not have discovered otherwise. I'm paraphrasing what President Kennedy said, but that was the message that he delivered to the American people. And he did such a good job of rallying the American people around this vision of American exceptionalism in that day that we didn't make it to the moon in 10 years. We actually made it in 8. And we saw one of the most expansive and innovative periods in American history unfold right before our very eyes. And we still see the benefits of that era today. The cell phones that we carry around, the flat screen TVs that we watch, the computers that we use, the GPS systems that navigate us from place to place, even medical technology, communicating technologies. So much innovation came out of that period of time. We have an opportunity in America to harness that great American character of innovation, just like President Kennedy did, around an idea of energy independence and security. As my colleague from West Virginia just pointed out, the President stood in this chamber and said that back in January. He advocated in his words for an all-of-the-above energy policy, one that includes all forms of energy. And yet his policies continue to do right the opposite, particularly where the coal industry is concerned. What if we had a national energy policy that went something like this? Starting today, America is setting a goal to become energy independent and secure in America by the year 2020. And we're going to harvest the vast oil and gas resources that we have. Experts say we have more of that resource now than any nation on the planet. We're going to expand our nuclear footprint. It's the cleanest form of energy on the planet. We're going to invest in and advocate for alternative forms of energy like wind and solar, biofuels, hydro, but we're going to let the market drive those innovations. And yes, we're going to continue to mine and use the vast coal resources we have, because we've got enough coal in this country to fuel our energy needs for generations. It's the most affordable most reliable form of energy that we know. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to have a regulatory process that requires that regulatory agencies like the EPA become partners in progress with America's industries and businesses. Rather than just throwing up barriers and saying no. If there's a reason to say no for public health or public safety reasons, then say no, but don't let no be the final answer. The American people have an expectation that their tax dollars are going to be used to move America forward, not to put on the brakes, kill jobs, ruin families, and make America less competitive in future generations. I believe if we had that kind of energy vision, we would once again see America's innovative wheels begin to turn. We would see young people lining up to get into technical programs and college programs to prepare them for careers in energy development, domestic energy development. We would see millions of jobs created. We would see industries crop up. We would see a resurgence in manufacturing. We would see America go back to work. And it would put in play the American dream once again for millions of Americans, millions of middle-class Americans who have begun to think that perhaps the American dream doesn't apply to them anymore. The American dream is still alive and well in our country, and all we have to do is plug in to the type of American exceptionalism that put us on the moon and go after a real energy independence and security policy that harvests our coal, uses the natural resources that we have, and puts Americans back in charge of their own destiny. I want to go a little bit into detail here on some of the comments that my former colleague, or my colleague from West Virginia and Kentucky and North Dakota made just a few minutes ago. We know that coal-fired power plants like the Cardinal, Ohio, and Samus plants, both of which are in my district, can be built with scrubbers in place so that coal can be used in a very environmentally safe way. The President and his administration have started this war on coal that focuses on both the mining of coal and the use of coal in power plants. This week, the EPA is expected to issue a rule on new power plants that will almost certainly ensure that under existing technology, no new coal-fired power plant will be built in America. The new rule will require technology called carbon sequestration and storage, and it's not commercially available, nor commercially viable. My friend from West Virginia, David McKinley, has legislation that says that the EPA can't issue a rule that requires technology that isn't commercially viable. I hope we'll consider that legislation in the House for two reasons. I think the American people have an expectation that people that make regulations that affect the economy, that affect the jobs, that affect the livelihood of Americans all over this country, that those rules are based on scientific fact and that they are technologically viable. That's not what we're seeing out of the EPA today. And number two, I think it is absolutely irresponsible for the federal government to essentially ban, a form of energy that has fueled America's energy needs for generations and can for future generations. Remember what I said earlier. 800,000 jobs are produced either directly or indirectly across our country by the coal industry. Before long, grid reliability will be in question, and rolling blackouts will be the norm again if we don't have coal power as part of our energy mix. I come from a background in information technology, and I can tell you that much of our technology is designed to operate on stable, reliable power. And blackouts and brownouts and dips in our power grid will put great stress on our technological resources. Don't take my word for it. Ask the experts. Not to mention that energy costs are going to rise. People will lose their jobs, and hardworking families will be forced to pay higher utility rates. Sadly, this new rule on power plants is just the beginning. Next year, the EPA is expected to release a new rule regulating existing coal-fired power plants. Now, if that rule is anything like the rule coming out this week, coal-fired power plants could go extinct in just a few years. We're already seeing the effects of the EPA's crusade against coal. In my district alone, one coal-fired power plant has already closed, leaving over 100 people without jobs. Furthermore, there are 6 other coal-fired power plants in my district, and if the EPA issues that unworkable rule next year, thousands in my district could be without jobs. Now, if the President's war on coal simply stopped here, the coal industry and the people employed either directly or indirectly by the coal industry might be okay. However, the EPA rules are just the tip of the iceberg, because the rest of the administration is also actively trying to shut down coal producers with a series of new rules. First, at the Department of the Interior, the administration has been trying to rewrite the 2008 Stream Buffer Zone rule for nearly 5 years now. This rewriting of the rule has been a disaster from the beginning, as the administration has wasted nearly $10 million taxpayer dollars and 5 years of our time on this environmentalist's dream. It might be a dream of theirs, but it's going to be a nightmare for the coal industry and the families across this country that are dependent upon it. We know that the preferred rule by the administration would cost thousands of jobs because the consultants they hired to do the analysis told us so. And it'll lead to coal production being cut by nearly half in America, but yet the administration appears unfazed and continues its efforts to rewrite the rule. That's why last year I introduced the Stop the War on Coal Act that would have stopped not only the rewrite of the Stream Buffer Zone rule, but also the EPA's misguided attempts to regulate coal-fired power plants. My colleague from Colorado, Doug Lamborn, and I have reintroduced similar legislation this year, and I hope that the House will once again pass it and send a strong signal to the President to stop this rewrite. Next, let's look at the Department of Labor. The President's Department of Labor is actively writing a rule dealing with coal dust that could potentially shut down totally underground mining. The rule is so unworkable and unreasonable that it's even been said that coal miners wearing full oxygen masks and tanks would not be in compliance with the rule. Think about that. Coal miners that would be breathing in pure oxygen would still be in violation of this new rule. Now, I'm not sure how a coal company could continue with a rule like that, and that's why we've been fighting against the implementation of this rule, called the coal dust rule, as well. But we and the American people should not be surprised by the President's actions nor the actions of his administration against the coal industry since he came into office. As our colleague from West Virginia pointed out, he told us back before he was first elected that his anti-coal policies would cause electricity prices to skyrocket and that it would bankrupt the utility company if it wanted to build a new coal-fired power plant in America. It might have taken him almost 5 years to deliver on those promises, but we're about to see him issue rules that will cause energy prices to skyrocket, make it impossible to build a coal-fired power plant, and kill thousands of jobs across the country. However, as we have seen tonight, there is a strong will here in the House of Representatives to stand up and fight back against the President's policies. So here's the message. We will not roll over because the future of our economy and the livelihoods of our constituents, our children, and our grandchildren, future generations are on the line. We will continue to fight through the appropriations process. We will continue to work hard to educate the public on these destructive policies until the President backs down. You know, I want to share one final story before I yield back. You know, I wasn't born into the coal production industry. I didn't grow up knowing a lot about coal production, but I sure learned a lot about coal consumption. I spoke to the Ohio Association of Rural Electric Co-ops about a month ago, and I shared with them that as a small boy, I was the utilities manager at a rural utility co-op. Now, they looked at me like some of you are looking at me, cocked their head kind of sideways and said, now how can that be? How can a young boy be the director of a utility co-op? You see, on that rural farm where we worked, we had no indoor plumbing, and my grandmother heated and cooked on a big black round pot-bellied stove. My job as a young boy, before I went to bed each night, was to make sure that the coal bucket was full on the back porch, so that when my granddad got up at 4:30 in the morning to fire up that stove so that Grandma could get up and start breakfast, it was there. It was also my job to bring in a cistern of water from the outside pump so she didn't have to go outside and get it. So in a very real sense, I was the utilities manager for that farm. I provided the fuel and ensured that the fuel was there to heat, to cook, and provided the water. Folks, that's the character that America was built on. That's what hardworking people along Appalachia, Ohio remembers. They dreamed of a future for their children and their grandchildren because they lived that kind of character. They still live it today. I want to thank my colleagues for coming tonight and join me in this effort to stop the administration's war on the coal industry. And, Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would remind members to direct their remarks to the chair. Does the gentleman have a motion to adjourn?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question on the motion is to adjourn. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
So the House is gavelled out, but members return tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern for morning hour speeches and noon for legislative work. Later this week, debate on a forest management measure that would direct the Agriculture Department to establish sustainable timber harvesting zones. Also expected, a bill that would revise the food stamp programs that were left out of the Farm Bill when it was debated in the House earlier this year. Also possible, work on a continuing resolution that would keep the federal government funded past September 30th. Follow the House live here on C-SPAN when members gavel back in on Wednesday.
House Republicans